All right. Where am I? Oh no. There. Forgot about that. And hello. Where are? Oh, god damn it. What happened to my shit again here? What the fuck is going on? Hello? Okay. Are we actually back? I think we are. I don't know what was that up with that. Um, but obviously something was wrong. Yeah, I got it. And of course my captions are all messed up and my computer doesn't even remember that I used captions apparently. So, yeah, there's that. Technology is just so lovely. Love it. Love it every minute. All right, we'll get there. It will happen. How's that? Oh, lovely. Now they're way too goddamn big. Appearance. What in the hell happened since yesterday is what I want to know. All right. As you can see, I was not prepared for any of this crap today. But here we are anyway. Okay. I think we've got things straightened out. And we can actually get into our reading, finally. Atlantis and the Kingdom of the Neanderthals, Chapter 5. So, here we go. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but let's jump into it. So, we're on Chapter 5, More Catastrophes. 18,000 years ago, when the last ice age, which began about 130,000 years ago, was particularly severe, the sea level was 120 meters lower than it is today. Then slowly the ice began to melt. About 14,500 years ago, after another temporary freeze called the Older Dryas, the melting suddenly accelerated. At that time, the ice cap of the North Pole still stretched down as far as the British Isles. Suddenly, an altogether swifter meltdown began. Icebergs flaked off the ice sheet and drifted into the Atlantic. About 12,000 BC, i.e., 14,000 years ago, a vast lake in North America, Lake Livingstone, collapsed and released such a huge pocket of water into the sea, 84,000 cubic kilometers, that the world's sea levels immediately rose by 9 inches, causing the first great flood. Then, erratically, the cold came back. We still do not know the reason for these swings in climate, although meteorologists often credit something called the Milankovitch cycle. Around 11,000 BC, the world froze again, a freeze known as the Younger Dryas, and temperatures dropped even lower than during the Older Dryas. Then around 9500 BC, another sudden melting took place, and within 50 years the world was drowned again. Another great ice lake, this time in northeast Canada, released its floodwaters. If Charles Hapgood is correct, this flood was the Atlantis flood, referred to by Plato. Its date corresponds exactly. But a third flood was still to come. Sometime around 6400 BC, another freeze took place and lasted about 400 years. Then once again, warm weather returned, and around 6000 BC caused one of the greatest floods so far. Hudson Bay was mainly responsible for this latest flood, when a huge ice plug melted and released millions of tons of freezing water into the sea. Other parts of the Great Canadian Ice Sheet followed the same route. The result was a dramatic rise in the sea levels of possibly 80 feet to their present level. It was this rise in sea levels that finally flooded the Black Sea, or the freshwater lake that then occupied its place in about 5750 BC. Ryan and Pittman date it to 5600 BC, but in these matters, precise dating is virtually impossible. The waterfall that came in from the Mediterranean was about 350 feet high, and Pittman, as we have seen, estimates its volume as equal to the water in 250 Niagara Falls. It would seem that Noah's flood, presumably also known as the Flood of Gilgamesh, occurred around 6000 BC, between 2 and 3000 years before the early Sumerian version of the Epic of Gilgamesh was written. This time frame sounds astonishing. I can understand Stephanie Dalley's skepticism when she argued that the Gilgamesh flood was far too late to be the flood confirmed by Ryan and Pittman. But apart from the local floods, which would seem to include Woolley's 10 feet of sediment at no great flood occurred after about 5500 BC, although there were plenty of smaller ones. As a result, I have to assume that human memory, aided by bards and minstrels, preserved the Great Flood story for 3,000 years. When we look at Gilgamesh or Genesis, one thing seems clear. This flood was not accompanied by earthquakes, erupting volcanoes, and the erratic movement of the sun in the sky that was chronicled in When the Sky Fell. Udanapishtim describes darkness and tempest, but not earth tremors. It therefore seems unlikely that this flood was the one described in so many Indian legends, from Canada to Peru, a flood in which the sun was said to have moved in the sky. And that legend was apparently why Indians of Mexico and Peru were terrified of an eclipse of the sun and performed sacrifices to avert it. Graham Hancock devoted many pages in Fingerprints of the Gods to these legends of the sun wandering from its course and the sky falling. We know the sun cannot wander from its course, but if the Earth's crust moved, as Hapgood suggested, the sun would appear to have changed its course. What proof do we have that the Earth's crust actually moved? One interesting piece of evidence can be found in the BBC book Earth Story, in a map that shows the Earth as it was 18,000 years ago. And there is a map here titled Glacial Maximum, the map of the ice sheet in America during the last ice age. So it shows the Arctic Circle, the North Pole, and the Tropic of Cancer. And it's showing what looks, well, it's white, so I'm going to assume that's ice that goes way down below the Great Lakes. So, okay, I'll show you that. So you can see all of Canada is covered in ice, and below the Great Lakes, so Minnesota and all that area would have been under ice too. And on the other side, it looks like that would be all of Russia, Finland, Sweden, that area down pretty much Maybe not Germany. Maybe just the northern part of Germany. Anyway, hard to tell on that map. This map clearly shows that at the height of the last ice age, the ice sheet in America extended south of the Great Lakes. A different map showed it extending south of New York. Yet in the British Isles, the ice does not even extend as far south as Cornwall, whose latitude is roughly the same as Newfoundland's, 700 miles north of New York. If this ancient ice sheet were to extend around the world at a uniform distance from the present North Pole, it would have to reach as far south as central Spain. In fact, as Hapgood had explained more than 40 years earlier, to account for this lopsided distribution of ice, the North Pole would have to be somewhere in the area of Hudson Bay. At some point since 18,000 years ago, the North Pole must have moved further north, or rather that part of the Earth must have moved south. And so the findings of Earth science in the 1990s tell us of three great floods since the end of the last ice age. The first around 12,000 BC, the second around 9,500 BC, and the third around 6,000 BC. And from its dating, the second of these floods is clearly the one that interested Charles Hapgood, the Atlantis flood. Now, as we can see, the major difference between the Atlantis flood and the Black Sea Gilgamesh flood seems to have been that the Atlantis catastrophe was accompanied by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. What happened at the time of Plato's Atlantis was sudden and violent, just as Plato described it. But what actually did happen? In 1993, Professor Alexander Tolman, a geologist at the Institute of Geology at the University of Vienna, and his wife, Edith Tolman, published a study in which they set out to answer that question. Their answer was that the Earth had been struck by a giant comet made of ice. They had even worked out the date, September 23rd, 7545 BC, a Middle Eastern tradition that the event happened on the day of the autumn equinox provided the date for the Tolmans. The comet's arrival caused an enormous tidal wave and filled the Earth's atmosphere with dust. The Tolmans said, resulting in the extinction of such species as the mammoth and the saber-toothed cat. The Tolmans were convinced that the catastrophe was the cause of not only Plato's great flood, but also Noah's flood in the Bible. They disagree with Ryan and Pittman that the Black Sea flood was the flood described in Genesis, but I believe strong evidence exists that the Tolmans were wrong on both counts. Their study was based on the discovery of an immense concentration of tektites that were laid down in sediment all over the world. In 7600 BC, the tektites, the Tolmans suggested, indicated the presence of a comet or large meteor. They also believed that there was evidence that the comet split into 7 smaller bodies. They quoted the apocryphal Book of Enoch that speaks of 7 stars, like 7 burning mountains falling to Earth. A similar breakup occurred in July 1994 before the comet Shoemaker-Levy struck Jupiter at more than 130,000 miles an hour, with a force estimated at 50 times the nuclear arsenal of Earth. The Tolmans also found evidence in radioactive carbon-14 in the trees of that date. This carbon, they claimed, was due to the destruction of the Earth's ozone layer by the comet, which had exposed Earth to more radioactivity from space. The Tolmans backed their theory with myths from many parts of the world, the Middle East, China, India, and the American continent. They said that the flood that struck the west coast of America swept so far inland that it created the Great Salt Lake on which Salt Lake City stands. They also noted that several of these myths described the Earth being threatened by 7 burning suns. The location of the 7 impacts can be seen from the map, and there is another map here I'll show you. The Tolmans added, quote, "This all makes it extremely difficult nowadays to maintain convincing arguments against the existence of Atlantis." End quote. One of the comet fragments fell, as can be seen from the map, in the China Sea, an observation, as we shall see, of some significance. An eighth small impact occurred in the Otz Valley in Austria, where the comet fragment formed the Koffels crater. This impact has been dated to about 8000 BC. The Tolmans' claims were supported in principle by an Oxford astrophysicist, Victor Clube, who summarized 20 years of research into cometary impacts in a book called The Cosmic Winter, which he co-authored with astronomer Bill Napier. Okay, I'll go ahead and show you that map, and it's captioned "The probable impact locations of the 7 main fragments of the comet that collided with the planet Earth about 9545 years ago and caused the flood." So you can see that. All right. Since the 1950s, scientists have believed that comets are not visitors from some remote region of outer space, but are instead fragments left over from the time when our solar system condensed from a cloud of whirling gas. In 1950, the Dutch astronomer Jan H. Oort suggested that the material of comets resides in a cloud of freezing gas in orbit somewhere outside of our solar system. Periodically, a passing star or a molecular cloud would dislodge some of it, Oort said, and send it falling toward the sun, and the fragment would continue to travel in a huge elliptic orbit at regular intervals of perhaps 77 years, like Halley's Comet, until it disintegrated. Most comets are a dozen or so miles wide and are believed to be made of fairly light matter, often gas. But clearly this was not true of Shoemaker-Levy. Comets tend to break down over time until they form a huge cloud of debris. When the Earth goes through such clouds, the result is a spectacular display of shooting stars. Most of these, of course, burn up in the Earth's atmosphere, but some are large enough to reach Earth, as was the case with the object from the Taurid meteor stream that exploded over Tunguska, Siberia on June 30, 1908, flattening and burning trees in an 18-mile radius circle. The meteors apparently failed to make a crater, vaporizing a few miles above the Earth. We were fortunate in 1908, for we now know that impacts from space have changed the history of our Earth and brought a sudden and violent end to geological ages. 60 million years ago, the Earth was struck by a giant comet or meteor. It fell into the sea at Chicxulub, off the coast of Mexico, and filled the Earth's atmosphere with a dust that eventually cut off the sunlight and killed off plant life and the dinosaurs that lived on it. Something similar has happened more frequently than we would like to contemplate. The comet that killed the dinosaurs is only one of 5 comets or asteroids that have caused major extinctions in the Earth's history. One at the Triassic-Jurassic boundary, 213 million years ago. One at the Permian-Triassic boundary, 248 million years ago. One at the Devonian-Carboniferous boundary, 308 million years ago. And one at the Ordovician and Silurian boundary 438 million years ago. It looks as if each new geologic era up to 60 million years ago had been caused by a comet impact. Chesapeake Bay, southeast of Washington, D.C., was created by a giant meteor 35 million years ago. But since the Earth's crust, unlike that of the Moon, is constantly changing, the craters tend to heal. In their book, Victor Klube and Bill Napier argue that streams of comets tumble out of the Oort cloud every 3 to 5 million years due to the Earth's passage through molecular clouds as well as the Earth's passage close to a spiral arm of our galaxy, the Milky Way. The two astronomers state that our solar system is due for another bombardment about now. We can see that such a notion is compatible with Tolman's belief that some giant body from space caused a widespread catastrophe around 7600 BC. Further support for Klube and Napier's theory came from Queen's University, Belfast, where in 1997 studies of ancient tree rings revealed that the Earth had suddenly cooled in the 9 years between 2354 BC and 2345 BC. Chick-fil-A. What's Chick-fil-A? Um, the temperature shift is believed by Napier to be evidence. That's how it interpreted it. Oh, what I read. Chick-fil-A. What, Chesapeake Bay or well, captions are certainly not perfect. The temperature shift is believed by Napier to be evidence of yet another cometary impact. Archaeological digs in northern Syria revealed signs of a catastrophic event at the same time that caused mud brick buildings to disintegrate. The event was almost certainly caused by the impact of a single comet or asteroid in the Mediterranean. Napier has pointed out that three major civilizations went into decline at this period: Egypt, Sumer, and the Harappan kingdom of the Indus Valley in India. He further said that 40 cities around the world were destroyed during the same period. The bombardment from outer space seems to have continued. French researchers in the Middle East have found layers of a mineral called calcite, which is normally found only in rocks from space, and which is estimated to date from 2200 BC. All this evidence suggests that around this period, Earth was struck by an asteroid or comet that cut off sunlight and caused crop failures. In case the reader is becoming confused by the sheer number of floods and catastrophes, let us attempt to bring a little order into the narrative. The first great flood, which marked the end of the Ice Age, occurred around 12,000 BC and may be ignored here, since it seems to have left no mark in myth or literature or even racial memory. The reason is obvious. It was due to melting ice and involved a mere 9-inch rise in sea level. The second of 9500 BC is Hapgood's flood, the flood that destroyed Atlantis. This is almost certainly the first flood referred to by Critias, who learned of it from his uncle Solon, who heard it from the priests of Sais in Egypt. The second flood mentioned by Critias must therefore be Ptolemy's flood of 7545 BC. Caused by the impact of a comet or asteroid. The third flood is the Black Sea flood, the flood of Gilgamesh. The fourth flood, as the Critias noted, is Deucalion's flood, which occurred in the Bronze Age around 2200 BC. This also seems to have been due to the impact of a body from space. Which leaves us with the problem that troubled Hapgood so much, and started him on this quest for Atlantis. What actually caused the Atlantis flood? The answer has to be an asteroid or cometary impact, and this is the conclusion that is argued brilliantly and conclusively in a book called When the Earth Nearly Died, Compelling Evidence of a Cosmic Catastrophe of 9500 BC, by D.S. Allen and J.B. Dallaire, the first a paleogeographer, the second an anthropologist, who is curator of the Museum of Geology at the University of Southampton. They argue that the day when the Earth was almost destroyed occurred at the time of the destruction of Plato's Atlantis. With painstaking thoroughness, the authors present in chapter after chapter, the book is massive, is so massive that the publisher had to print it in double columns, the geological and mythological evidence that some great cataclysm shook the earth around 9500 BC, and it is not until about halfway through that they outline their own theory that some cosmic body, either a giant meteor or a fragment of an exploding nova, hurtled through our solar system 11,500 years ago, leaving a trail of wreckage. The authors suggest that it tilted Uranus on its side and tore away a moon, which went spinning through space until it ended up as the outermost planet, Pluto, ripped a satellite away from Saturn, then demolished a planet between Jupiter and Mars, which became the asteroids. As it passed the Earth, it increased the tilt of the axis and produced those catastrophic effects that Charles Hapgood had noted and ascribed to the slipping of the Earth's crust. This additional tilt, which is now worn off, explains what the astronomer Norman Lockyer called the obliquity of the ecliptic, the slight tilting back and forth of the Earth's axis, although this is now being questioned. Particularly fascinating in their account of the destruction of Tiwanaku, for Allen and Dallaire have no doubt that it was this chunk of space debris, which they call phaeton, that caused the upheaval. They produce evidence that not only was Tiwanaku devastated, but that the Andes suddenly became considerably higher in 9500 BC. For example, there are many stone walls and agricultural terraces in the Andes that are well above the present level of perpetual snow and demonstrate that they must have been upraised in historical times. I did not know that. I've never heard of that. That there are walls above the perpetual snow line. That's very interesting. Again, Lake Titicaca is full of sea creatures and was obviously once at sea level, and there is an ancient strand line on mountains nearby with a white band of calcareous deposits of algae. This is more than 2 miles above sea level. Geologists have always assumed that this elevation occurred many millions of years ago. Allen and Dallaire present us with clear evidence that it happened when some giant meteor struck the Earth in 9600 BC. Significantly, Tiwanaku also has its flood myth. The god Viracocha was the creator of the Earth and lived in Tiwanaku, but when human beings became disobedient, he destroyed them in a great flood that engulfed the Earth. Only 2 people survived, a man and a woman, who had taken refuge in a box, and the subsiding floodwaters left them at Tiwanaku. Then Viracocha created the peoples of the earth and gave each one his own language and songs. There is an obvious parallel here with the biblical flood, although the man and woman sound more like Adam and Eve, but after Noah's flood in Genesis, all human beings speak the same language until God gives them different languages to make them incapable of building another Tower of Babel and scatters them over the earth. In When the Sky Fell, Rand and Rose Flamath had discussed many flood legends, particularly those of American and Canadian Indians, and had pointed out the similarities between the flood stories of the Haida Indians and the Queen Charlotte Islands, of the Queen Charlotte Islands off the northwest coast of Canada, and the flood story of Sumeria, not the Epic of Gilgamesh, but an earlier version discovered in Nippur at the end of the 19th century about a priest called Zayasudra, who seems to be identical with Utanapishtim. Both stories state that men of long ago lived in a golden age when life was carefree. The Sumerians say that their ancestors lived in an island called Dilmun. The Haida that their forefathers lived in the world's largest village. The gods decided to destroy them. Various reasons are given, from the sinfulness of mankind to the complaint that they made too much noise. I haven't heard that one. In the Haida myth, survivors escaped in great canoes, which took them to a new land where they landed on a mountain. In the Sumerian story, Ziusudra builds an ark and eventually lands on a mountaintop. Rand Flemath notes that the Haida speak a language called Na-Dene. Dene, I'm not sure. This is, in fact, a whole group of Native American languages, of which the Haida version is the oldest. And incredibly, investigation in the 1980s by the Russian linguistic expert Merit Rulin indicated that this might well be related to the Sumerian language. If so, there could hardly be more remarkable proof of the existence of Hapgood's worldwide maritime civilization. It is worth bearing in mind that Hapgood's interest in the problem of Atlantis started in 1949 when a student named Henry Warrington asked him about the lost continent of Mu that, according to legend, also sank beneath the waves at the same time as Atlantis. Hapgood told him to go away and research Mu, and then added as an afterthought that he might as well examine the evidence of Atlantis at the same time. Warrington would have discovered that Mu, or Lemuria, has a respectable scientific provenance. In the 1850s, an English zoologist named P.L. Sclater observed a curious similarity between animals and plants as far apart as India and Australia, and speculated that there might have been a sunken continent connecting them. This, he thought, existed about 55 million years ago, during the Eocene. He called it Lemuria because his missing continent connected places where lemurs, a primitive species of monkey, were common. In the 1880s, a brilliant but erratic, I had no idea that's how it got its name. In the 1880s, a brilliant but erratic scholar named Augustus Le Plongeon claimed to be able to read text of the ancient Maya of Mexico and announced that he had found references to a continent called Mu that had vanished beneath the Pacific after a tremendous earthquake. The mention of the earthquake suggests that we could be speaking either about the Atlantis catastrophe or the Tolman's comet strike of 7500 BC. In the remarkable book called Eden in the East, the Drowned Continent of Southeast Asia, Professor Stephen Oppenheimer argues that the Sumerians were descendants of survivors of a great flood, which also drowned the coast of China and a Pacific continent that lay in the regions he calls Sundaland. What Oppenheimer is suggesting bears some resemblance to the British zoologist P.L. Sclater's suggestion that the land bridge between India and Australia, but Sclater thought that Lemuria existed 55 million years ago in the Eocene. Oppenheimer thinks the land bridge was finally submerged as recently as the time of the Great Flood of 6000 BC. Oppenheimer discusses Hapgood and the Piri-Reis map and Graham Hancock's belief that there was a lost founder civilization in Antarctica, but his own candidate for the lost founder civilization is the submerged continent of Southeast Asia, which is called Sundaland. This, he believes, not only preceded Sumeria and Egypt, but was the source of both. So, just as a side note, they're talking about the land bridge between India and Australia. Um, and one of the things I remember learning about in school is um, about 55,000 years ago, that land bridge they think existed. But um, there's one little problem with that. With the ocean levels as low enough to allow for that land bridge, you still got the Marianas Trench cutting right through the middle of it. And at that point, um, it's something like 200 miles wide. So, and the reason I bring that up is the Australian Aborigines are thought to have first appeared in Australia around 55,000 years ago, 55, 60,000 years ago. And so the theory is that they crossed this land bridge. Well, no one has any explanation as to how they got across 200 miles of open water. Um, Mainstream anthropology and archaeology um, just ignore it as if that problem doesn't exist. But of course, it does. Um, and my teacher um, theorized that they actually had the ability to build boats. Maybe not great boats, but to build boats that long ago, which goes against the mainstream um, theories of anthropology, paleoanthropology, because they don't think anybody had the smarts to build boats that far back. But there's more and more evidence coming out now that probably was the case, not just for Australia, but for lots of stuff. Anyway, moving on. Um, Not only proceeded. Okay, so and here's the map that they're showing: the lost founder civilization of Sundaland after Stephen Oppenheimer. So this is just to show Sundaland. So you can see it looks like Southeast Asia there, but it is. I don't know exactly where the Marianas Trench would be in that map, exactly where it cuts through there, but it's not present on the map. Moving on. Oppenheimer's account pointed out that, according to Genesis, the Garden of Eden was located in the east. In the Bible's words, quote, "As men migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there." End quote. The land of Shinar is, of course, the biblical name for Sumeria, the first civilization. Oppenheimer pointed out that the Sumerian language, like the language of the region's neighbors, the Elamites, was unique among Semitic languages. Babylonian or Akkadian, which replaced it and in which the Epic of Gilgamesh was written, is a more typical Semitic language. In some respects, Sumerian was more like Finnish or Hungarian. No one quite knows its origin. Unfortunately, Oppenheimer seemed unaware of one vital piece of information: Tolman's comet impact of 7545 BC. The sheer magnitude of the catastrophe Oppenheimer described makes it unlikely that the massive flood was due to melting ice. On the other hand, two of the Tolman's cometary fragments struck in the Indian Ocean and in the South China Sea, while two more landed near the west coast of South America. These four would have been enough to submerge Sundaland. Tolman's comet certainly makes a better candidate for Oppenheimer's catastrophe than the Black Sea flood. In fact, Tolman himself wrote, quote, "In Asia, mankind reached the then ice-free mammoth steppes of Siberia 15,000 years ago. The islands of Southeast Asia were also accessible over the then dry continent shelf, and the latest research indicates that man got as far as Australia between 50 and 40,000 years ago after traversing the Timor Sea by boat. See, he's actually bringing it up by boat, but um, now granted, I graduated in 2004, but back then they were still denying that it was by boat. This area was devastated by the flood in 7545 BC. Tolman owns a Chinese woodcut with a dragon motif that symbolizes the flood. The woodcut reveals a huge tidal wave and a funnel of ejected water with the characteristic tulip form. Tolman describes the woodcut as, quote, undoubtedly based on a transmitted eyewitness account of the geologically authenticated impact in the South China Sea, which has been confirmed by rock vitrification. It looks misspelled. It reads vitrifician. I don't know. Is that correct? Products in Vietnam. Otherwise, the details of such an impact, which have only recently been scientifically confirmed, could never have been so accurately depicted. End quote. Oppenheimer suggested in Eden in the East that after the flood, refugees from Sundaland went in all four directions of the compass. Some carried rice-growing skills into India, probably to the Indus Valley. Some headed to southeast China, Burma, and Tibet, taking their art with them. Others went south to Australia and east to Micronesia. All these lands, Oppenheimer claimed, show the linguistic and genetic traces of the nomads who had been flooded out of their homes. From India, according to Oppenheimer, others went to Egypt and Sumer and founded new civilizations. In a book called Historical Metrology, author A. E. Berriman points out that what he calls the Indus inch is precisely twice a Sumerian measure called the Shusi, while many of the ancient Polynesians called their sun god Ra as in ancient Egypt. Quote, in this dispersal, wrote Oppenheimer, the Southeast Asian explorers fertilized the Neolithic cultures of China, India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and Crete. End quote. In short, they were the true founders of Western civilization. Oppenheimer could well be correct, but if Charles Hapgood is also correct, then a worldwide culture already existed before the Sundaland catastrophe. Even while Hapgood was still alive, new pieces of evidence kept surfacing for his ancient seafarers. One of the most intriguing is the story of the cocaine mummies. Oh yeah. In September 1976, the mummy of Ramses II, the last of the great Egyptian pharaohs, who died in 1213 BC, arrived in Paris to form the centerpiece of an exhibition at the Museum of Mankind. Ramses had spent much of his life battling the Hittites, and the great hall of columns in the Temple of Karnak is perhaps his greatest memorial. But when his mummy was examined, it was found to be deteriorating. Scientists were asked to repair the damage. One of these scientists was Dr. Michel Lescaut of the National History Museum. Lescaut or Lescott examined a piece of mummy bandage under an electron microscope. To her astonishment, she recognized grains of tobacco, a finding that seemed absurd, for tobacco first came to Europe from South America in the time of Christopher Columbus. The announcement of her find caused a storm. Egyptologists declared that the tobacco grains must have come from the pipe of some modern scientist who was smoking as he studied the mummy. So Lescaut took samples from deep inside the mummy and again found tobacco grains. Still other experts refused to accept the presence of tobacco. They said the grains probably came from some other plant, such as henbane, which is a member of the tobacco family. Lescaut knew they weren't, but decided not to press her point. 15 years passed, then in 1992, German researchers at the Munich Museum began studying the materials used by the ancient Egyptians in mummification. Since they wanted to find out whether any drugs were present, they turned to a forensic scientist whose expertise had often been called upon by the police in cases of suspicious deaths. She was Dr. Svetlana Balabanova of the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Ulm. Dr. Balabanova was not asked to study the mummy of anybody as distinguished as a great pharaoh. She was given the remains of a mere priestess named Henut Tawi, who had died around 1000 BC in Thebes. Tawi's tomb had been plundered by robbers in the 19th century, and the mummy was then sold to Ludwig I, Bavaria's art-loving monarch, who gave it to the museum in Munich. Dr. Balabanova tested the mummy utilizing an antibody reaction. She also analyzed the molecular weight of some of the body's substances and graphed the results. Both approaches showed that the mummy contained both nicotine and cocaine, which had been used as preservatives. Her findings were even more startling than Lesko's. If Balabanova was correct, then the ancient Egyptians had not only been in contact with the Native Americans of the east coast of the Americas, but had also been to the opposite coast as well. The ancient Peruvians also mummified their dead. Cocaine is native to the Andes. When a tired traveler arrives at a hotel in La Paz or Cuzco, he is given a cup of tea made from coca leaves, which instantly relieves the dizziness due to the high altitude. Balabanova's findings make it look as if the Egyptians knew about cocaine's preservative properties more than 3,000 years ago. Ooh, I can tell my voice wants to go. How many more pages do we have? Holy fuck. We got a long way to go. We have 10 pages. Okay. Well, we'll tough it out. Just need to hydrate more. Keep my throat wet. Okay. The reception of Balabanova's analysis was even stormier than in the case of Lesko. Balabanova received abusive and insulting letters accusing her of being a fantastist. Her response was to publish her figures and graphs. In response, the archaeological establishment fell back on its second line of defense and suggested that the mummy was contaminated. To those accusations, Balabanova said that as a forensic scientist, contamination was the very first thing she had ruled out. Then her critics suggested that the mummy was a forgery, a fake concocted by Arab racketeers. Additional tests, including carbon dating, proved that accusation to be untrue. Embarrassed by this publicity, museum officials concerned were inclined to disregard the whole thing, but Balabanova but Balabanova went on testing mummies, regularly finding tobacco and cocaine in them. The skeptics continued to insist that it must be some other type of tobacco, native to Europe and long extinct, but their suggestions still failed to explain the presence of cocaine. Someone recalled that in 1975, Roman jars had been found off the coast of Brazil in a bay known as the Bay of Jars, a place where jars had been turning up for centuries. The Roman jars were almost certainly from a sunken Roman galley. Since Roman historians would probably have mentioned if they had known about transatlantic voyages, we can probably assume that the galley was swept out to sea by storms and carried across the Atlantic by the same westward currents that in 1969 would carry Thor Heyerdahl's ship Ra. But in the case of the Egyptians, the sheer quantity of mummies with cocaine traces ruled out this explanation. Now, since Egyptologists have found no other signs of tobacco or cocaine in ancient Egypt, we can probably assume that no regular trade existed in these two commodities. The drugs must have been brought to Egypt at great expense and used to preserve the mummies of kings and queens. Excuse me, guaranteeing their immortality. But we are left with the unavoidable conclusion that the Egyptian priests knew about the great continent across 3,000 miles of ocean and knew that could be reached by taking advantage of the currents. Unless those explorers trekked across forests and prairies and mountains to reach Peru, we must also assume that they sailed around the Cape of Storms unless they took the even longer Pacific route. There could hardly be stronger evidence for Hapgood's ancient ocean-going civilization. Hapgood's map below, and there is a map here, maps of the ancient sea king from maps of the ancient sea kings, and his account of the map of Haji Ahmad is also relevant to this discussion. As we look at this map, which appeared in Turkey in 1559, we note that the drawing of Europe is not particularly accurate. The Mediterranean, for example, is entirely the wrong shape, and it is not clear whether the body of water running south from it is the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf. According to Hapgood, the coast of Africa does not compare in accuracy with the Piri-Reis map of nearly half a century earlier. On the other hand, the American continent is so accurate that we could easily mistake it for a modern map. It seems unbelievable that Columbus had arrived a mere 67 years earlier. How had the mapmaker gained such accurate knowledge when the continent was still mostly a vast wilderness? Above all, how had the Pacific coast been drawn with such precision? Pizarro and his conquistadors had landed on the coast of Peru as recently as 1532, a mere 27 years earlier. This was simply no time for the knowledge of detail to have been developed. There can be only one solution. The European part of the map must have been based on one of the old inaccurate maps, probably Ptolemy. But the American part must have been based on an ancient Portolan made by someone who knew both coasts from personal experience. This might, of course, have been ancient Egyptians in search of cocaine and tobacco, but there is evidence that whoever made the Portolan came far earlier than Ramses. For there is another oddity about the Haji Ahmad. The Haji Ahmad map. Looking down on the North Pole, as it were, it shows Asia and Alaska joined together. It does not, admittedly, show Beringia, the land bridge across the Bering Strait, which was submerged by the sea at the end of the last ice age. But if the two continents had been separate, as they are today, it would have been easy enough to indicate this with a narrow gap between them. As it is, they are simply joined as if a land bridge 1,000 miles wide. Hapgood quotes an Oxford scientist, Derek S. Allen, who pointed out that what is now the island of Novaya Zemlya is shown as being joined to the Siberian coast, and that what are now the New Siberian Islands are shown as an area of dry land. In other words, the mapmaker showed the world as it was about 14,000 years ago. All right, let me show you this map, which I don't know if you're going to be able to see very much from it, but we'll give it a try. So there you go. Take a good look. All right. But who was around 14,000 years ago to make maps? The answer is probably plenty of people. To begin with, the forebears of the Atlanteans, as well as the Sundalanders, the early Australians, and the builders of Tiwanaku, which Poznansky dates to 15,000 BC, at which time it would still have been at sea level. But a major problem remains unanswered. What turned out our ancestors into sea kings? With a little imagination, we can put ourselves in the place of our Cro-Magnon forebears at the end of the Ice Age, realizing that the ice is melting, that the summers are becoming warmer, that game is more plentiful, and that they can venture farther and farther from the shore in search of fish. But who was the original Columbus to cross the Atlantic, the first Balboa to cross the Pacific? And what gave them the courage to attempt anything so terrifying? These questions were answered almost accidentally by a young Costa Rican professor named Ivar Zapp, and he started by trying to solve one of the world's greatest mysteries, the stone balls of Costa Rica. They were discovered in the early 1930s when the United Fruit Company began clearing jungles of southwest Costa Rica in Central America to make a banana plantation in the area called the Diqui Delta. The workers hacking and burning their way through jungle began to find huge stone hemispheres sticking up out of the earth, and some hard digging revealed that they were spheres, like giant beach balls, except that they were made of granite. The largest was over 9 feet in diameter, the smallest the size of a tennis ball. It was obvious that the spheres had once formed part of various religious sites. They had been supported on top of mounds and were surrounded by stelae and statues. What was so astonishing was the perfect workmanship. Many were exact spheres, and the surface was as smooth as paper. But while giant stone balls are certainly an oddity, there is something about them which quickly exhausts one's curiosity. Some of the wealthier inhabitants of San Jose and Limon, Costa Rica's major cities, had them transported onto their front lawns and learned in the process that the largest weighed 20 tons. A few archaeologists looked at them, shook their heads, and opined that they probably represented either the sun or the moon, or perhaps both, and turned their attention elsewhere. 10 years or so later, an American archaeologist named Samuel K. Lothrop was making a brief vacation in the Diqui area with his pretty wife when he saw one of the balls on a lawn in Palmer Sur. He was told that there are hundreds of them and that no one had any idea of what they are. Here was a puzzle worth solving, and since Lothrop happened to have time on his hands, bandits were making it difficult to continue his current task of excavating the pottery of the Chortega Indians, he decided to devote some time to this intriguing problem. He made little headway, for a smooth ball is devoid of clues, but at least he went and looked at some of the balls that had been left in situ and noted that they often seemed to occur in threes, in the form of a triangle. Others occurred in straight lines consisting of as many as 45 spheres, but the triangles were oddly irregular and were often made of balls of different sizes. That suggested that there was some special purpose in their arrangement, some hidden code, but what purpose was impossible to fathom. Lothrop wrote a paper on the stone balls, which was published under the auspices of the Peabody Institute in Harvard, and returned to less impenetrable mysteries. No other archaeologist pursued the mystery, for Lothrop seemed to have exhausted it in his brief paper. 3 decades passed, and the stone spheres seemed to have been forgotten. Then in 1981, Ivar Zapp, the young professor of architecture at the University of Costa Rica, thought he saw a new approach. His inspiration came from the work of an English scholar named John Mitchell. whose name had become associated with ley lines, long, straight tracks that run like canals across the English countryside. Zapp recalled the long, straight lines of stone spheres in the Dickey Delta and began to speculate. To follow Zapp's reasoning, it is necessary to explain that he knew of John Mitchell and ley lines. Okay, we're on page 102 and it goes to page 106, so that's how far we've got left to go. The lines had been discovered in 1921 by an English businessman named Alfred Watkins, who was riding his horse across the hills near Bredwardine in Herefordshire, when he noticed that some ancient footpaths run straight as an arrow for mile after mile, often toward hilltops, and it suddenly struck him that England seemed to be crisscrossed with hundreds of these old straight tracks. He called them leys or lees, and concluded that they were ancient trade routes used by the earliest inhabitants of Britain. When John Mitchell came to the problem in the mid-1960s, it was largely because he was fascinated by the mystery of flying saucers. Mitchell noted the curious fact that many reports of flying saucers placed them close to ley lines, which are obviously more easily seen from the air than the ground, and especially at the crossing points of several leys, or lees. Learning that the Chinese have similar lines called lung mei, or dragon paths, which are designed to channel the magic energies of heaven and earth, feng shui, Mitchell speculated that ley lines may be lines that mark some current of earth force. He learned that dowsers, for example, can detect ley lines by the response of their dowsing rods or pendulums. Mitchell noted that ley lines often pass through holy sites such as burial mounds, old churches, and ancient monuments like Stonehenge. Wow. Man, sorry. I need to breathe more. Ivor Zapp could see that the stone balls of the Dickey Delta seemed to pose some of the same questions as the megaliths of Stonehenge, or for that matter, the huge stones of the Great Pyramid. How were they carved so perfectly? How were they moved? Some of them were even found high in the mountains along the coast of Costa Rica, and it was impossible to imagine even a large team of men rolling them uphill. It would be too difficult and dangerous. Zapp took a party of his students to the Dickey Delta to try and fathom the mystery. They were baffled, but he began to see a gleam of light. Lothrop had left diagrams of what many of the original stones had looked like before they were moved to museums and front lawns. He noted two groups that seemed to be arranged on either side of a straight line, and the straight line pointed directly at the magnetic North Pole. In that case, he wondered, was it possible that the other sides of the triangles pointed towards points on the Earth? When he tried out this theory on a map, extending the lines from the ruler with a ruler, the results were disappointing. The lines seemed to point at nothing in particular, but then of course a map is a flat projection of the curved surface of the Earth. Zapp tried it again, this time with a tape measure and a globe, and knew immediately that it was not all self-delusion. One line projected from Palmer Sur, where spheres had been found, went straight through Cocos Island, then through the Galapagos Islands, then to Easter Island, and he recalled that similar spheres have been discovered on Easter Island, although they were small compared to the giant balls of Costa Rica. However, when he looked more closely at the sight line from Palmer Sur to Easter Island, Zapp began to experience misgivings. The line actually missed Easter Island by 42 miles. Then he recalled something that reassured him. Polynesian sailors can detect the presence of an island up to 70 miles away by studying the waves and the clouds, for both are disturbed by the presence of land. Sailors also note the presence of land-based birds like the tern and the noddy. So a 7,000-mile-long sight line via two other islands, which missed Easter Island by only 42 miles, would be regarded a hit. That also reminds me, again, an aside, same teacher that talked about the Marianas Trench and all that, also taught us about this group that read the currents and waves, um, and they actually build this apparatus, just flat thing out of sticks that they use to teach their children how to read the waves. And we saw examples of that, and it was pretty cool. And they've been doing that for who knows how long. So I think that's basically what he's referring to there, is that particular group. But we were taught they could find islands hundreds of miles away. His doubts were set at rest as he began to study other sight lines. Another side of the same triangle extended across the Atlantic led to the Straits of Gibraltar. In another group of stones, the line led to the Great Pyramid, and in yet another, it not only pointed to southern England, but ran straight through Stonehenge. That could hardly be chance. So it seemed that Ivor Zapp had discovered the purpose of the stone balls of Costa Rica. They were navigational aids. They explained why some were in straight lines on plains and some were in the mountains overlooking the sea. It also explained why more of the stone balls had been found on the island of Cano off the south coast of Costa Rica, looking across the Pacific. Lothrop had also noted that the balls were often found in association with Indian cemeteries, which led to the speculation that they might be some kind of homage to the dead. But if in fact they were direction markers, you might expect them to be near cemeteries, since the sailors would hope for guidance from the spirits of dead navigators. The question of when the spheres were carved remains a matter for debate. Archaeological finds in the Duquesne Delta date from 12,000 BC to 500 AD. Some archaeologists, according to the internet site on Costa Rica, date the stone balls to the most recent period, between a few centuries BC and 500 AD. And archaeologists tend to be intensely conservative, assuming that is the best way to avoid outraging their colleagues. Extreme caution in dating a new find is a way of showing that you are a sober and respectable member of the academic community, not likely to leap to wild conclusions. But this can be a mistake. Zapp recalled that in the 1920s, when the Mesoamerican archaeologist Matthew W. Sterling found an immense negroid head at Tres Zapotes in Mexico, he suggested that the Olmec culture that carved them might be as early as 600 BC, and was greeted with hoots of derision from his academic colleagues. But Sterling was in fact too conservative, and the Zapotec culture is now known to date from 1200 BC. Zapp knew Hapgood's work and was perfectly aware of the possibility that the sailors who set up the stone balls were Hapgood's ancient sea kings, and other evidence soon supported that hypothesis. A student named Umberto Cairo noted that the story of Sinbad the Sailor in the Arabian Nights had a description of a steering device called a kamal. This consisted of a long knotted cord with wooden squares at either end. The knots represented the latitudes of various ports. The Arab navigator would hold between his teeth a certain knot and point the string to the pole star to determine the ship's position. But Zapp had seen this knotted string before on a small figure Lothrop had found near a group of stone balls. The figure was holding the ends of the string in either hand and its center in his mouth, creating a V shape. Zapp had also been seen similar figures from all over the world, from pottery designs in pre-Inca burial sites in Peru to depictions in the Indus Valley in India. Costa Rica is, of course, a navigator's culture, since it is on one of the narrowest parts of Central America and two vast oceans on either side. Humberto Caro came upon another interesting piece of evidence. He found an article by Thor Heyerdahl which explained the techniques of sailing balsa rafts against the wind and current. Thousands of years before the keel was invented, Peruvians used removable centerboards on their rafts, which served as keels and enabled them to tack. Pizarro had encountered a whole flotilla of such rafts off the coast of Peru, of enormous size, which were moving toward them against the wind and current. Pizarro learned that they made journeys on these rafts along the whole coast of South America. Heyerdahl, of course, used a similar raft called the Kontiki, one of the names of the god Quetzalcoatl, to prove that ancient mariners could have crossed the Pacific, and later on reinforced the point by crossing the Atlantic from Egypt to America. When Christopher Columbus landed in Costa Rica in 1502 on his fourth voyage across the Atlantic, the explorers were received with great respect by the Native Americans and taken on a 2-hour walk to the grave of an important person, which was decorated with the prow of a ship. Almost there. The Costa Ricans were obviously introducing these great navigators from Spain to one of their own famous navigators. The stone lapidus, or funeral slabs, upon which the dead man was laid out looked like the centerboards of the Peruvian balsa rafts and other figures. Obviously, priests and kings were laid out on identical centerboards. The reason was obvious that the kings were being laid on stone replicas of the boards that played such an important part in their lives. But could primitive navigators have sailed such enormous distances? It is true that Heyerdahl seemed to have proved the point, but would Costa Rican soldiers of, let's say, 5000 BC even have known of the existence of Easter Island? And even if they had, would they have dared to launch a balsa wood raft into the vast and empty Pacific Ocean? Then Zapp came upon a book that answered his question. It was called We the Navigators by David Lewis, published in 1972, in which Lewis described sailing with native islanders on native craft all over the Pacific, over 13,000 nautical miles. The islanders used the ocean lore that they learned from their forefathers, and without any modern navigation equipment, never failed to reach their destination. Zapp and his fellow author George Erickson had filled in the detail that Hapgood had been unable to supply and explained how ancient mariners had sailed the 7 seas from China to North America. All this, Zapp could see, might be used as confirmatory evidence to support the possibility of Hapgood's worldwide maritime civilization. We're done. That's it. That's the end of that chapter. I liked it. I was enjoying it, but at the same time, my voice is going, and I don't breathe properly when I'm reading, so I start getting droopy. Lack of oxygen. So, anyway, that is that chapter. Some very interesting stuff. We will pick up on the next chapter Thursday. So I'm going to take a break in this session, and it's late enough. Oh, crap. I'm supposed to be playing We Happy Few tonight. Yeah, I'll go ahead and play, but it's going to be a short session. So I'll go ahead and end, and I will see you all in a little bit.
Prepare to die.